Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, the origin of every English city's name. Let's learn. My name's Connor if you're new. Hope everyone's doing well. Original link to the video from Rob Words, top of the description as always, preemptive like. Let's get started. Let's go.
The origin of every English city's name. There are 55 of them. It's quite a lot. So let's get cracking. Welcome to another Rob Words. First, some quick context. England's place names are a product of England's history. They've been influenced by, in order, the Celtic Britons who were around from the Iron Age, the Romans who spent a few centuries there, the Anglo-Saxons who came after them, the Vikings who took control of a massive chunk of England, and then William the Conqueror's Normans. Throw in
I usually think of the Anglo-Saxons as Vikings. Is that wrong to do? Is that a mistake?
Throw in some Christianity and a millennium of lazy pronunciation and mishearings, and you get to the place names we have today. Now, we're just going to look at the cities because we'd be here all day otherwise. Contrary to popular belief, there are no specific criteria for a place in England to be designated a city. It is just that at some point, the monarch has to have decided that it is. None of this, it has to.
I know that we are called New England, so it's not a by chance or a coincidence, but I'm just going to go through the names that I just know are names of towns and cities in New England.
The cities, because
Bradford, Bristol, Cambridge.
We'd be here all day otherwise.
Chester. Coventry.
Contrary to popular belief, there are no specific
Exeter, Gloucester. Leicester.
criteria for a place in
Lincoln.
England to be
London. Manchester, I think.
designated a city. It is just that at
Plymouth. Portsmouth. No.
some point, the monarch has to
Southampton. Wakefield.
have decided
Winchester.
that it is.
Worcester.
None of this,
Jesus Christ. Nothing original in town names over here.
it has to have a cathedral or a university. Nonsense. That's why they're of all shapes and sizes. So with which city do we start? Well, how about the city of London? Because not only is London our nation's capital, but it is also potentially one of the oldest and most mysterious place names that we have. The earliest known name for London is what the Romans called it, Londinium, but we have no idea what that means or where it came from. The Romans liked to adapt the existing names of places rather than come up with new ones, but historians haven't been able to make any Celtic words fit. Could it be from this, meaning marsh with a fort? Nope, there's no evidence of a fort. Could it be from this, meaning fast-flowing river? Maybe, but
Did the Romans call the Thames? Because maybe they called it like the River Lund or something? I don't know.
it's a bit of a leap, isn't it? So historians think the name could come from even before the Celts, from a language we know nothing about. Wow. That's great, but now I have to give you one that we can explain, don't I? So let's go with the presidential sounding Lincoln, a city whose cathedral was once the tallest structure in the entire world. Its name is a Celtic-Roman hybrid. The Celts named it Lindon, no relation to London, using their word for pool, and the Romans called it Lindum Colonia after they built a colonia there, a kind of retirement village for soldiers. Through a few centuries of laziness and mumbling, you get from that to Lincoln. One of the theories behind how Colchester got its name is from one of those Roman colonia stuffed with ex-legionaries. It looks like it's named after the river Colne, which in turn might be named after a colonia, although some historians reckon that Colne is actually Celtic because it pops up in other names in other parts of the country. Now, the Chester in Colchester is the bit we really need to talk about because the story behind it is surprisingly surprising. At first glance, it seems simple. The Romans built a fort there, and their word for fortification was castrum. So, they slammed that on the end of the name. Easy. But nope. Yes, the Chester comes from the Latin for fort, but the Romans did not put it there. It was the Anglo-Saxons who put the Chester in Colchester to say, hey, that's where the Romans were. And the same goes for every Chester, Castor, and Cester in the country. So let's tick off some more cities.
That's
We've
cool.
got Chichester, which is probably named after an Anglo-Saxon called Cissa. Winchester, with the win, thought to come from a Celtic word for a meeting place, pronounced Wenter by the Romans.
So all of these endings of these town names, or a lot of them, are the adapted version of the Anglo-Saxons calling them the place where the Romans were. That's really, really cool.
Manchester is potentially named after a breast-shaped hill, meaning it's related to the words mammal and mama rather than
Memory.
man. The Romans called it Mancunium, hence the locals are still called Mancunians. And then there's Chester, which is frankly just cheating. It was a Roman fort like the rest of them, but has resisted attempts to differentiate it with something extra at the start. The names Lega Chester, Legion Chester, and West Chester failed to stick. Etymologically identical to the Chesters are the Casters. Lancaster was the fort by the river Lune, in turn thought to come from a word meaning healthy or pure. Doncaster is at the river Don. Don is just a Celtic word for river, so it's literally the river, as are the various river Avons, also Celtic, and river Ouzes. Exeter is another Castor on a river, which used to be this mouthful before it passed through the laziness filter. It's named after the river Exe, which again probably just means river, specifically a river replete with fish. More on rivers to come, and also bridges, because there is a lot of crossover, pun intended. But first, the final Roman forts, the cesters, not a single one of which is pronounced like it's spelt. We do it to confuse tourists. Cirencester stays true to its roots, but it is not a city, so we're not interested. But we are interested in Leicester. It's named after a Celtic tribe, and to the Anglo-Saxons was Ligere Ceastre.
About Leicestershire.
You can actually see a version of that on this super old map. But bit by bit, we shed those tiresome syllables in pronunciation. Anyway, speech didn't match spelling because, you know, most people couldn't read. To the west, saucy little Worcester is named after the Weagora tribe, and the southern city of Gloucester was the fort at Glaive, thought to maybe come from a Celtic word for glow. So with all those Cesters, Casters and Chesters, the Anglo-Saxons gave a nod to the Romans who'd come before them. But almost everywhere else they named or renamed using their own language, Old English.
Sure, Shire.
And they are responsible for the vast majority of the place names that we have today. Among them, Norwich, which is the North Wich, Wich being an Anglo-Saxon word for a settlement or village. It gives us the Wick place names too. The northernness of Norwich is likely in comparison to their fellow East Anglians down in Ipswich,
Oh, I
which
love that name.
isn't a city, and I bet they're a bit annoyed about it. East Anglia is, of course, so called because the Angles were there. Another Anglo-Saxon pairing are Northampton and Southampton, but this time it is the southern settlement that is actually a city. Southampton was originally actually another witch, but it changed from Hamwich to Hamtun. In this case, the ham bit comes from the Old English for an enclosure, probably the same root as when we say something is hemmed in fact. We'll talk about a different Anglo-Saxon ham a bit later. But anyway, the tun, or tun, refers to a farmstead or village. Eventually it becomes our word town. Up in West Yorkshire, Wakefield shows off another Anglo-Saxon suffix. Field meant, we'll have a guess. Yes, field. And a wake was a kind of medieval village festival. So despite sounding somewhat funereal, Wakefield is actually a fun, festive name related to fairs.
Field for festivals.
Another city with an Anglo-Saxon name is Stoke-on-Trent. The River Trent is just referenced to differentiate it from various other Stokes. Stoke coming from the Old English for outlying farm or settlement. The same word also gives us the place names ending with stock. Now, I've already shown you lots of maps in this video, but here's one more, and it's a very important one. It's the electoral map of the UK following this month's general election, where large parts of the country turned red as Labour won a historic majority. But now they're in power, getting an unbiased view of how the government is doing can be tricky.
Ground news.
Take this story, for example, on Labour's decision to release offenders early to reduce prison.
I hate journalism and politics nowadays. It's just a bunch of, maybe it was always like this, I don't know, but I think ground news is a great thing. I don't trust any left or right wing news source. So I really think this is a
overcrowding.
good thing that
there
they came up with.
50 outlets reporting on it.
And make sure if you're interested and you learned it here to use the promo codes and links, all right?
From all over the world, but you can see that the language they use varies with, for example, left-wing outlets stressing it'll prevent the collapse of the prison service. Meanwhile, right-wing media emphasize that thousands of criminals will be released early onto the...
This is why I hate it's like just don't lie. Well, they're not lying, they're just wording it to make it sound how they want it. I just want to get the news without someone tinkering their words to give me a certain perception.
Streets. Now here on my channel, we delve into language and its history to understand how words and context shape meaning. And Ground News does something similar with headlines, allowing us to see different perspectives on the same story. Ground News is an app and website that compiles news articles globally, providing additional context to help you make informed decisions. I've partnered with Ground News a few times because I believe in what they do, and in a crucial election year like this, it's never been more important. I get to follow the news that's most important to me. I'm here in Germany, so I like to keep track of what's going on back home. Plus, with the Vantage plan that I use, you get access to the blind spot feed, showing you stories that are over or under reported. That way, you won't miss a thing. See through the headlines and stay fully informed. Go to ground.news/robwords or just use this QR code and get 40% off unlimited access to Ground News. Now, I said we'd cross this bridge when we got to it, and that is the Bridge, because Cambridge is so called because there was a river crossing there. It was originally called Granta Bridge because it was on the River Granta. However, it appears that the Normans struggled to pronounce that with their fancy French mouths, so it morphed into Cambridge or Cambridge, and then, rather ridiculously, the name of the river was changed to fit. So the river running through Cambridge is now called the Cam, although at some other points it is still the Granta. Cambridge's university rivals in Oxford can also pin their place name on a passing river. Ford is a really common Anglo-Saxon suffix, meaning, well, ford. It's a place where you can get across a river, often because it's shallow enough. Oxford is where you could easily lead oxen over the river.
That's so
near the Welsh
specific.
border, Hereford means place where an army can cross, this time over the River Wye. Then across in Essex, so called because it was the eastern kingdom of the Saxons, you find Chelmsford.
This one makes complete
It's thought to be named
sense.
after a fella called Cholmer or Colmer, who also gave his name to the River Chelmer, which you can ford there. And then back up in Yorkshire, Bradford simply means broad ford. There's one more ford city left, and that is Salford. The sol or sal bit comes from the sallow trees.
Wait, does that mean the name Brad means broad?
Which were in Ford. The sol or sal bit comes from the sallow trees, which were in abundance there. They are a type of willow and also immortalised in the names Sale, Sellafield and Selborne, among others. Salford ain't the only city to be named after a tree. The tree at the end of Coventry means just that.
No.
Tree. It's reckoned that the rest of the name comes from whoever owned that tree. One theory is that it was a Saxon called Coffer. And another tree appears to have taken root in the name of Lichfield. In fact, not...
That makes me think that these places, the tree places, must have started, like, named themselves so early on, and that when it was named, it was so small that a singular tree was just a really good landmark, you know?
Not just one, but many. The old Celtic name meant grey wood. The Saxons added the field to make it field of the grey wood or grey trees. Another notable field is Sheffield, the field next to the river Sheaf. Sheaf itself means to divide or separate. For example, to be ashiaf in Old English was to be expelled. The river acted as a boundary between territories. Yorkshire's rivers feature heavily in its place names, actually. We already heard about Doncaster's Don, into which the Sheaf runs, incidentally, but also the name of Leeds flows from the River Aire, albeit indirectly. Its Celtic name, Landensis, meant people of the fast-flowing river. By the time the Anglo-Saxon monk, the Venerable Bede, was taking notes, it had become Loidis. And Kingston upon Hull, commonly known as just Hull, is named after the river there, which is called the Hull, either from the Celtic for muddy, which it flipping is, or the Old Norse for deep, which it presumably also is. Old Norse is the language of the Vikings, by the way, plenty more on them to come. The Kingston bit of Kingston upon Hull literally means King's Place or King's Estate. The king in question is Edward I, who, according to legend...
Longshanks? What news of the north? Not my gentle son.
...was chasing a hare in the area one day and fell in love with it. The area, not the hare. So he had it for his own. The area, not the hare. And the tiny, tiny North Yorkshire city of Ripon perhaps also gets its name from the nearby waters. Its earliest recorded name is in Ripon, but no one knows precisely what that meant. One theory is that it means at the river bank, and that's backed up by its location near where two rivers meet. But I'm actually more convinced by the theory that it's named after the Ripper, who were an Anglian tribe. Now,
it's funny. Well, when we get so far removed from the type of dialect that was used to name the place, and you don't really think of it, you just think of it as a name, right? And it just sounds like a lot of places just sound like beautiful names. But it seems like no city was just like, let's come up with a nice name. What's the perfect name? And like, aha, it's all just descriptors. And I think that's really cool.
Arguably England's worst watery place name belongs to the similarly small city of Ely, which means Eel Island. Yes, Ely is thought to get its name from the fact it's a bit Ely. And on the south coast, Portsmouth is so called because it had a port at the mouth of a river.
That's the easiest one. I could have guessed that.
Although a famous old document called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims that Portsmouth was actually named after a Saxon called Port, which is a slightly less boring explanation, I suppose.
No, yeah.
And the equally mouthy Plymouth sits at the mouth of the river Plym. Plym perhaps simply comes from the Anglo-Saxon for plum, so I suppose I could have mentioned this one in the tree section too. Another watery one, perhaps the wettest of them all, is of course the city of Bath, which is named after the Roman baths that were there. The Romans called it Aquae Sulis, meaning waters of Sulis. Apparently Sulis was a local goddess of water and healing. The Anglo-Saxons simplified things by just calling it Bathan, or baths. The nearby city of Wells has a similarly literal liquid-related name. Its Old English name was Wella, and it refers to the 3 wells dedicated to St Andrew there. Now, while we're in the vicinity, we should bring up Bristol, whose name is somewhat water-adjacent. Quite literally, it's thought to mean assembly place at the bridge. At one point, it was just a bridge stow. However, the theory is that the name changed because of a quirk of the local accent. Supposedly, folk in the area had a habit of pronouncing...
Wait a second. So the people... Like, some states are named after, like, or like Virginia was named after Elizabeth I. So... Wait, this makes complete sense. If there is a similarly called town or city name in New England or in America, especially in New England, because that's the first place is kind of contacted by the English, I'm sure if you name, all right, this is Bristol. You are probably from Bristol in the UK, right? That's kind of cool.
W's.
I'm sure that's something that was so obvious to people. And
local
not
accent.
to me.
Supposedly, folk in the area had a habit of pronouncing W's as L's, a bit like some people now say gill instead of girl, or bottle instead of
gill. Bottle.
Bottle. Now, Bridgestow really did have a W at the end, but it's thought that fancy folk, keen not to seem ignorant, may have overcorrected that W into a L, even though it was never meant to be a L in the first place. Thus, with a bit of laziness thrown in around the middle, you get...
Classic. A smart person trying to fix what they thought was an error from the dumb person, but ended up being the dumb person himself.
From Bridgestow to Bristol. One last wet one is way up in Liverpool, which is actually a comparatively new name.
pool of livers.
was first recorded in the 12th century, so after the Norman conquest. The pool bit is thought to refer to a muddy tidal creek that perhaps no longer exists there. And the liver? Well, maybe it was shaped a bit like a liver? Sorry, I don't know, actually. I couldn't find a good explanation for that one.
Maybe it was a common thing that was eaten over there, some liver dish.
Now, before we get on to the Viking and Norman nomenclature, we need to sweep up some more Anglo-Saxon stuff, because there's a really common place name suffix or group of suffixes that we haven't talked about yet. You see, when the Angles and Saxons felt one of their territories was under threat, usually from the Vikings I just mentioned, they would build their own little fortifications that they called Burhs.
Dang it, was Shire included in the Shire? Like Hampshire.
And the locations of these forts are preserved in the place names ending Bur, Borough, Bruh, and Bury. The city of Canterbury was the Burr of the Canterbury.
Well, wait a second. It seems like the Shire names are used for like larger areas than cities.
Bruh, and Bury. The city of Canterbury was the Burr of the Cantii, what the Romans called the people of Kent, although the twist in the Canterbury tale is that it was the Jutes who built the fortification there, not the Angles nor the Saxons, although the term Anglo-Saxon actually refers to all three groups, and more, in fact. Salisbury played host to another Anglo-Saxon burr. The Salis bit, though, which we pronounce so apathetically now, is something of a mystery. It's thought to potentially have the same root as the Sarum in the name of the astonishing nearby historical site of Old Sarum. Indeed, at one point, Salisbury was called New Sarum. But where that Sarum comes from, nobody knows. Another city that's thoroughly burrowly is Peterborough. In fact, the locals for a time just called it Burgh, but eventually realised that that wasn't specific enough. So they extended it to Peterborough in honour of the monastery around which the protective walls had been built. A monastery dedicated to none other than St. Peter. Once the Anglo-Saxons left behind their colourful pantheon of pagan gods and converted to Christianity, they took to their new faith with gusto, and the Peter in Peterborough is just one holy hint of that. Another one is in the name of St. Albans. It's named after the very first British saint, St. Alban, who was martyred there in what the Romans had named Verulamium. He was executed in the 3rd or 4th century for becoming a Christian, a conversion that the Romans would not that long after rather hypocritically make themselves. The city of Westminster also has obvious ecclesiastical links. The minster in question is the abbey that remains there today. The west part may well have been to contrast it with St. Paul's to the east. But hiding its holy history just a little bit better is the Lancashire city of Preston. You'll recognise the ton bit, the Anglo-Saxon settlement suffix, but Preston is specifically thought to be the settlement of the priest or priests. An abbey was set up there by St. Wilfrid. Right, we're making some good progress, aren't we? Let's keep going. The priests of Preston were not the only people to get a place named after them. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon...
Sorry, Lancashire. It was the area that my mom's father, my grandfather on my mom's side, down back, came from, out of England. Lancashire.
...thought to be the settlement of the priest or priests. An abbey...
I think it was Littleborough, Lancashire County, England.
...was set up, thickly thought to be the settlement of the priest or priests. An abbey was set up there by St. Wilfrid. Right, we're making some good progress, aren't we? Let's keep going. The priests of Preston were not the only people to get a place named after them. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons made a bit of a habit of it. Birmingham is named after a fella called Bjormer. That's where the Birm bit comes from. The ing bit is an Anglo-Saxon element meaning the people of, and the ham, also from Old English, an ancestor of our word home, means homestead. So Birmingham means homestead of the people of Bjormer. It was the home of Bjormer's tribe, the Bjormingas. Also in the West Midlands, Wolverhampton has nothing to do with wolves. It's thought to be named after a lady called Wulfrun, who was granted the land by Ethelred the Unready. If so, that makes it the only English city named after a woman. Although there is a theory that Ely is named after the famously female St. Athelthryth rather than Eels.
I love this combined AE looking thing. Let's bring it back.
Let's hope it is. Anyway, Wulfrun's new land included a place called Llantorn, meaning something like high farm. Her name, plus that, gave Wulfrune Llantorn, which in the 1,000 years since has just become Wolverhampton. Back down on the south coast, the city of Brighton and Hove needs to be taken in two parts. The Brighton bit was originally Bjorthelm's Toon, or Bjorthelm's Farm. Bjorthelm is thought to have been a person, perhaps named for his bright helmet. The much longer name, Brighthelmstone, was actually in use until as recently as the 19th century. The Hove bit of Brighton and Hove is, I'm afraid, yet another mysterious one. It's perhaps from the Old English Hofer, meaning courtyard. The German Hof means the same thing now. Okay, hold on to your feathered hats because we're off to Nottingham next, where I suspect the tales of Robin Hood would have been somewhat less romantic had they gone with the city's original name. Nottingham has not always been Nottingham. It used to be Snottingham. That's right, it was named after a fellow called Snot, and specifically means homestead of the followers of Snot. There's that ing again. These are Snot's people. It is a city of snot. Snotty, snotty Nottingham. It perhaps isn't the association with nasal discharge, though, that meant Snottingham lost its S. More likely, the Normans just struggled with that sn sound, and lucky for the city that they did. Okay, it's Viking time, because while we're in Nottingham, we're in one of the so-called 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the massive chunk of England that the Norse invaders seized from the Anglo-Saxons. To this day, you can see where the Vikings were just by looking at the names of the places. Close to Nottingham is the city of Derby, another of the 5 boroughs, and more prestigiously, my hometown, which we used to spell in a way that actually fits with how British people say it. The B in Derby is a classic Scandinavian suffix. It's fairly generic. It means anything from farm to settlement to village. So let's just say place. And in Derby's case, it means place of the deer. They replaced the Anglo-Saxon Northworthy, which I rather like. But anyway, other Viking B places include Whitby, Grimsby and Selby. However, Derby's the only one to have achieved city status so far. As important as Derby and Nottingham were to the Danes, they were nothing compared to their beloved capital of York, the development of the name of which is satisfyingly organic. The Celts called it something along the lines of Eborus, which the Romans adapted into their name, Eboracum. Both meant place of the yew tree. However, when the Anglo-Saxons came to adapt that, they got their translation a little bit wrong and called it Jorforbij, place of the wild boar. The Vikings then put their spin on that and called the place Jorvik, but after they left, the locals struggled with that V. To the people who remained, a V was the same as a U, so they likely pronounced it along the lines of Jorvik. And from there, you basically are already at York. Now further north, Durham wasn't actually in the Danelaw, but it appears to have been close enough for Old Norse to have influenced the name. It used to be called Dunelm or Dunholm, a hybrid name combining the Anglo-Saxon for hill, dun, and the Scandinavian word holm, meaning island or sticky out bit of land. It reflects the fact that it's on a hill almost completely surrounded by the River Wear. Over the centuries,
I love how it just completely makes sense with where you think of Viking invasions in the British Isles and the Viking names of cities. Obviously, that's going to happen. It's still cool to think about.
Anglicised, and the name morphed into Durham.
Beautiful.
While we're on the Wear, let's follow it up to Sunderland, a city with an unusual story to tell. So you know how if we say something is ripped asunder, we're saying that it has been detached from something else. Well, that idea gives Sunderland its name too. It is land that has been in some way sundered from somewhere else. The leading theory is that it refers to the fact the land was granted to a group of monks living on the opposite side of the river, hence the Weir sundered it from them. I really like that one.
A big theme I'm seeing here is that places were named by people at the time not who did not take into account people in the future wanting to know. Like, there was no, like, it was all, like, where it said, like, land of the Burhs or whatever. That's just classic. You don't, like, that's something that could change a lot, you know, depending on whether Burhs are grazing or not. It's just very much, a lot of these names are just in the time descriptions of what the people saw there, and with no taking into account, like, whether or not it would be a sufficient town name to people in the future, you know? Something that, again, seems obvious after you think about it, but
now
still
let's take
cool.
the short trip to Newcastle, where the name requires rather less explaining. It means
A new?
New Castle. It's finally time for the promised Norman nomenclature, the nomenclature, because William the Conqueror's lot bloody loved a castle. They couldn't get enough of them. Did you know that there was not a single
Same.
castle in England before the Normans turned up? But after they arrived, they put them anywhere and everywhere that they felt a little bit unsafe. The castle in Newcastle was probably new in comparison with the castles the Normans had already built in Durham, York, and Richmond to protect against Scottish invaders. The Normans actually didn't generally meddle all that
It's another perfect example of just, like, it's new right now, Newcastle, boom, done.
much with England's place names, Scottish invaders. The Normans actually didn't generally meddle all that much with England's place names, but on a few occasions they added to them to show off that they were now in charge. For example, the town of Ashby de la Zouch was just called Ashby until the Zouch family took control, and Leighton Buzzard was so called by the Boussard family. But there's only one current city that the Normans renamed in that way, and it is Milton Keynes. Now, there's a bit of a joke, although I think some people think that it's the truth, that the place is named after a pair of Johns, the poet John Milton and the economist John Maynard Keynes. But that is not the case. The Milton...
So it's not Milt on Keynes, it's Milton Keynes.
And the economist John Maynard Keynes.
Keynesian economics?
The Milton bit is a simple bit of Anglo-Saxon. It is a shortening of Middleton, meaning middle village. All Suttons mean southern village, and all Nortons mean northern village. Anyway, the Keynes bit comes from the Cahagne family, who came over with our friend Willie the Sea. Wow, just 3 more cities to sweep up, the ones I didn't know where else to put. Okay, first, Southend-on-Sea, whose simplicity is surely its strength.
Yeah.
The original settlement was at the south end of a village called Brittlewell, and it sits on the sea. Now, the other extreme of England is Carlisle, whose name is perhaps a Roman-Celtic hybrid. It's thought to mean
Carl's Island?
Fort of Lug, who was a Celtic god of skills. The Romans called it Luguvalium. But after the Romans left, the locals translated it back into their local, sadly extinct, form of Celtic, Cumbric, in which it was Caerluel and thence Carlisle. Our final city name comes from another Celtic stronghold way down in Cornwall. It is the tricky to decipher Truro. This name might come from the Cornish, another Celtic language, Triveru, meaning 3 rivers, but maybe not. It might be from another lost term, meaning place of turbulent waters. We don't know. The mystery
You've got to be on...
remains.
Continues.
The Celtic languages have
It's got to mean 3 something. True.
so much more to offer in terms of place names. That is why I have limited this video to just England. Wales and Scotland have their own stories to tell. But if you haven't...
Those would be really cool to see, Scotland and Welsh ones, because I think they'd be less affected by the constant changes of population in England, especially on the south and the east. So I think you could probably see some more organic to the British Isles town names and city
enjoyed
names.
this video. I posted some extra
Loved
stuff
it.
about English place names on my Patreon here, and I think you'd enjoy this video as well.
That's the one
Thanks
I watched right before this.
Brown News, you should check them out too, and thank you to you for watching. I'll see you in the next
Thank you
thing.
for making.
Cheerio.
Cheerio. He just seems like a great guy, and he's actually kind of funny. It's a great video. Loved it. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. Any explanation to something dumb I might have said, which is a high possibility, or anything at all. All right. See you guys next time. Bye.